Like, if it were going to break, it's this time. We're in this tricky place of, you don't want to use the rules of thumb, this time is different, be careful, we've gotten burned if we were to this time is like every other time, that really, gave some bad insights. But then as we get further and further away from some of the very unusual features of this cycle, well, then some of those more usual rules of thumb, you probably want to pay attention to them. We don't quite know what to trust.
Imagine spending an hour with the world's greatest traders. Imagine learning from their experiences, their successes, and their failures. Imagine no more. Welcome to Top Traders Unplugged, the place where you can learn from the best hedge fund managers in the world so you can take your manager due diligence or investment career to the next level. Before we begin today's conversation, remember to keep two things in mind. All the discussion we will have about investment performance is about the past, and past performance does not guarantee or even infer anything about future performance. Also understand that there's a significant risk of financial loss with all investment strategies, and you need to request and understand the specific risks from the investment manager about their product before you make investment decisions. Here's your host, veteran hedge fund manager, Niels Kaastrup-Larsen.
Welcome back to another conversation in our series of episodes that focuses on markets and investing from a global macro perspective. This is a series that I not only find incredibly interesting, as well as intellectually challenging, but also very important given where we are in the global economy and the geopolitical cycle. We want to dig deep into the minds of some of the most prominent experts to help us better understand what this new global macro-driven world may look like. We want to explore their perspectives on a host of game-changing issues and hopefully dig out nuances in their work through meaningful conversations. Please enjoy today's episode, hosted by Alan Dunne.
Thanks for that introduction, Niels. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Claudia Sahm. Claudia is Chief Economist at New Century Advisors and also the founder of Sahm Consulting. She's also the author of the Stay-at-Home Macro Substack. She's probably best known for her recession indicator, the Sahm Rule. She was previously Director of Macroeconomic Research and Senior Fellow at the Jain Family Institute, and prior to that, Director of Macroeconomic Policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, where she advised Congress on the CARES Act. Earlier in her career, she was an economist and section chief at the Federal Reserve Board, and also was a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors. So, Claudia, great to have you on today. How are you?
Great to be here. Thank you.
Good stuff. Well, I went through all the kind of the main points of your background, but we always like to start by just getting a bit of a flavor from our guests as to how they got involved in their respective fields. So, I mean, what got you interested in economics, and how did you end up in your current position?
I was extremely fortunate when I went off to college, to liberal arts college, Denison University, to have the most amazing economics professors. When I went to college, I didn't even know what an economist was, let alone that I wanted to be one. And within pretty short order, I was convinced that, economists can do good in the world. Like we have tools to go at problems that are really important. I've always been very motivated by more public policy problems that economists can help with. And, and as I was off and running, some days I've questioned whether economists really can and do good in the world. But I think that's the orientation I've tried to take to it, and have been very fortunate. Like I said, all across that way is my education as an economist and the professional experience. I've had a chance to live that dream to some extent.
Very good. Well, and obviously you've been very involved in advising on policy and formulating policy. So I think we'll obviously get to that as we go through the conversation. I mean, you're probably best known, rightly or wrongly, for the Sahm Rule. Probably a good starting point. Maybe could you tell us what that is and what it's saying at the moment about the current state of the economy?
The origin of the Sahm Rule ties very much into why I'm an economist. I worked on a proposal with several other economists on how to prepare us better for the next recession. So this was work done in 2019, before we even knew that recession was coming. And the idea was to take policies that we often do, in my case, the stimulus checks, and put them on autopilot, tie them to economic conditions, have them be ready to go. And as soon as the economy takes a turn for the worse, get the help out. Like, don't, Congress figured out ahead of time, then get going. So to do these kind of projects, you need to have a indicator, a rule that says, okay, hit send, get the money out. And this was a recession indicator. It was named after me later. It has not been used in that sense of no one has got money queued up and ready to go in Sahm Rule triggers. I am sorry to tell everyone. And yet this idea, what are the conditions that we would see out in the economy that would very predictably tell us we are going into a recession, is very important to know that early on, because things, once they start going south, can head south fast, right? So it's like to try and get those, what are those early signs? The Sahm Rule uses the recession indicator that I have, uses the unemployment rate. It uses changes in the unemployment rate. So there's no magic level. Like, the United States gone into recessions with the unemployment rate of 4%, and they've gone into it with the unemployment rate at 8%, right? It's really about how are things, deteriorate? Are they getting worse? And what is the case, at least looking over the past several decades, it doesn't take much of an increase in the unemployment rate to tell us we're in a recession, right? So very specifically, the Sahm Rule says that you look at the monthly unemployment rate in the U.S., take the 3-month average, and the whole series, that most recent value, if it's a 0.5 percentage point or more above its low over the prior 12 months, you're in the early months of a recession. Like, we're not forecasting a recession. We are in a recession. The first 2 to 3 months. Now, a 0.5 percentage point doesn't sound like a lot. And frankly, in the scheme of a recession, it isn't a lot. In a typical recession, even the most mild recession in the U.S., you'll see a 2 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate. More typically, it's something like 4 percentage points. Right? So again, we're trying to get this early warning of where things are headed, because if you are going to step in as a policymaker and make a difference, you have that opportunity is at the beginning, or that's a real opportunity that can also pass you by before you even realize we have a problem. In the last few years, there has been a cottage industry discussion of, are we in a recession? Is a recession coming? Is a recession inevitable? And sadly, we're back into the stage of it where the unemployment rate in the U.S. has drifted up. Right. So earlier, when there were all these recession fears, the labor market in the U.S. looked great. So the Sahm Rule it has not hit that 0.5 percentage point level, and there's nothing magical about it. Just because something worked in the past doesn't make. But we're much, much, much closer to it than we've been at any point in this recovery.
Yeah. So we would be just there or thereabouts. I'm thinking, is that right? Like, it's about, I think there was a low bit 3.4, and we're up to, I don't know, the most recent reading was 4.
It's about 4/10.
Yeah. 4/10. Okay. Yeah. So
yeah.
we're getting very close. So based on that, I guess, is it fair to say, Sahm Rule aside, if you're looking at the broad set of macro data at the moment, would that concur with your assessment, or would you be saying, well, maybe it might be a bit out this time, or do you think the risks are stacked in favor of recession at the moment?
So in general, like, if I'm trained just as a macroeconomist advisor, what's happening in the world and the economy right now, I would always look at a wide range of information. Like, I wouldn't even just rely on my own rule, right? Like, there's no reason. When you're doing policy, and it had a reason why we needed a specific trigger to turn out. But we're not in that where we can look at all kinds of information and stuff through it. There are definitely concerns. I see this more as risk. Things have moderated. Like, we've gotten back into quote unquote better balance, as Fed Chair Jay Powell likes to talk about balance. I think in the U.S. we had unlike some of our peer countries, we had a very rapid recovery. Like, and not just inflation came back. We had the jobs, the growth, the spend. The United States last year had above trend growth. Things were just have been moving really fast, and we want to get onto a glide path. We want to come out of this in a sustainably good place. When things are running too fast, it's often not sustainable, and you end up crashing. So what we've seen in the past year of this moderation for a lot of different reasons, in terms of workers coming back, in terms of some of the pent-up demand being worked out, in terms of just a lot of the irritants from COVID and from the war in Ukraine on the U.S. economy working out. So we expected and we needed, in all likelihood, to see some moderation. The tricky thing is, well, we've kind of had enough of that. Like, we're in a good, moderated place. This looks like where we could be in a growth path, but that means we're much more susceptible. Like, we don't have the strength for policymakers' mistakes to lean upon, right? Like, you're kind of at a spot where you're more vulnerable than, say, a year or two ago when things were really strong in the labor market. And the labor market for the U.S. really is the linchpin, because most Americans spend what they make either because they have to or they like to, and most Americans, what they have to spend comes from their paychecks. So we've seen a very positive, virtuous circle between the labor market and the American consumers. If you lose that, then you're done, right? And so just watching the U.S., the labor market, and how it's doing is the big sign. And of course, then, in good $25 trillion plus economy, hundreds of millions of people, right? It's hard to get a read on, well, even how is the labor market doing? And we've gotten the indicators, what we know from the labor market recently, it's been much more of a muddle in terms of, but that also tells you we're not in the place like a year ago. There was no muddle. It was like, this is really strong.
Yeah. On that, there's a lot to digest. You've got, the most recent data was seemingly strong, but at the same time, the prior numbers were weak. And then you've had a recent pickup in jobless claims. And at the same time, the jolts have been easing. Putting it all together, how would you characterize it? And also, there has been some suggestion about questions about, the validity of the establishment data, low response rates, etc. How much of a concern is that, do you think?
It is imperative that one brings all the pieces of data together, right? Because the employment report that we recently received for May, if you went in and just if you said, I can only look at one series, right, to make my judgment, which I feel like sometimes that's how the outside world is going to go pick one and go run with it, then your headlines would be wildly different, right? The payroll employment number in May looked great, far bigger increase month over month than what had been expected. It had been weaker the month before, but still, like, even setting that aside, this is a really big number. So then people are like, the labor market is strong and, defying expectations. Okay, so, but then if you went into another, let's say the unemployment rate, it hit 4% for the first time in over 2 years. We've had a notable increase in the unemployment rate since the middle of last year. And then even within that, the survey that gives you the unemployment rate, it also has an estimate of employment that's very much, not totally exactly, but it has some very, clear ties to the jobs number that's in the survey. And that employment number was horrible. It was like a decline of 400,000. So you had this, if you picked any one piece, you could go off and running and say very strong statements about. So then that's a case where you put it together, and yet it is very frustrating and unsatisfying at a moment like this to be able to step back and say at the data, well, it's just kind of a muddle. Because honestly, that's not good enough. Like if you've got this like very positive, very negative, something in between, like how do we interpret that? There are measurement concerns. Like there are things that are popping up, and this happens all the time with data, right? Like no data are perfect, and there are issues, and it's complicated to be able to estimate any of these. The survey that goes into, say, getting these payroll numbers, it's like 100,000 firms for all of the U.S. that are representing all. So it's like, and this is always the case, right? I'm not saying that this is something new to right now, but you can imagine that there are times, and some of the very wonky, which I will not get into, but some of the wonky issues that are popping up, say in like how we're measuring the payroll jobs numbers, these kind of issues show up in the quote unquote turning points, right? When the economy starts to change, like if you've made assumptions about what's the pace at which new businesses are being created, and what's the pace at which they're leaving. So this the birth death model, right? So because you have a survey, you don't get to add back in new firms. You're missing those new firms, right? When you do the survey, so you have to make assumptions. Well, those kind of models are fine, as long as things are kind of moving along as they have been recently. If you start to say, for instance, see the economy slow, or things, just soften up some, well, you're probably going to be being too optimistic about those new firms, those births, and thus could get the total jobs created too optimistic. And then when you get more information, you're like, oh, okay, no, we were starting to slow. And so, so that information will come in later. I mean, this is the real irony or frustration of trying to look at the macro data. It's like when you most need that information to be accurate, when things are starting to change, is when it can put the most pressure on the statistics. Because they just, the assumptions that are necessary to get the job done are going to be most vulnerable when things are changing. And that's why, to the recession indicator, you're trying to find these subtle and yet reliable changes. Because it's not going to jump out at you until it's either far too late, or it's like 5 years later after you've done all the data revisions. When you go back, you're like, oh yeah, I can see it now. And it's like, yeah, but we didn't see it then.
And do you think the unemployment rate is the most reliable number for that? Or, I mean, the Fed at times has looked at other measures like U6, etc. Is the unemployment rate just chosen because that's what people focus on?
There's a kind of an old adage among economists. Is send me to a desert island and I got to pick one macroeconomic statistic to take with me to like say how the economy's doing, it'd be the unemployment rate. As a cyclical indicator, right? If your concern is, are we in a recession, going into a recession, the unemployment rate has a lot of signal relative to even say payrolls. So looking for negative declines in payroll employment is not going to get you moving early.
I mean, a lot of people would often say, I mean, okay, it might not be the case in this cycle, but, often argue, well, the labour market, the unemployment rate's a bit of a lagging indicator that you should really look, obviously the standard leading indicators haven't been very successful, things like the yield curve, etc. But do you think in this cycle things are different and that it is something more to focus on in real time, more so than some of those traditional leading indicators?
Yeah, so this is where it gets, so it can get interesting. So what I've been working on, what I've been talking about with the unemployment rate, this is an indicator of we are in a recession. This is not, do we forecasting a recession? This, like the Sahm Rule is not the yield curve. thankfully. But it is true that the labor market in general is lagging, right? It takes time. It's like the snowball that turns into the avalanche, right? Like it's already, started to go that way before. But just because the unemployment rate gets to its highest level, even actually after recessions end, typically is when the unemployment rate hits that whole path from going into the recession to the worst of the recession, like that does follow in a dynamic, right? And so that's where the Sahm Rule, this half a percentage point. And there's other people that have tracked, if a 0.3 or 0.4, like depending on whether you're like, I want to be totally accurate, I'm in a recession, or I want to try and get ahead of a recession. Like these small increases, these have been very reliably associated with recessions. And this cycle has been so unusual in so many different ways that even what I think most people would consider an even more tried and true recession indicator, we're in a recession, it completely fell apart. So in 2022, we had 2 quarters of consecutive declines in real GDP in the US. And many people refer to that as a technical recession. That in some parts of the world, that is like how a recession is defined, is 2 quarters declines. And there was no recession in the U.S. That was when there's, recession, U.S. recession, blah, blah, blah. And then I can say, no, look at the labor market. Labor market is amazing, right? Consumers are spending. Like this is some other, like there were things going on that seemed very COVID related in GDP. But in all honesty, you have to go back to 1947 in the U.S. to find 2 quarterly declines in GDP outside of a recession. And yet, for a lot of our conversations about COVID and the disruptions it caused, a parallel to World War II is not a bad parallel, right? That could be the most comparable cycle that we have in our statistics. So if these relationships, the small changes and small increase in the unemployment rate, being in a recession, like if that relationship were going to break down, if the Sahm Rule were going to break, in that it triggers, we hit a 0.5 percentage point, and then the unemployment rate just kind of stops rising, no recession. Like if it were going to break, it's this time. We're in this tricky place of you don't want to use the rules of thumb, This time is different. Be careful. We've gotten burned. If you were to this time is like every other time, that really, gave some bad insights. But then as we get further and further away from some of the very unusual features of this cycle, well, then, some of those more usual rules of thumb, you probably want to pay attention to them. We don't quite know what to trust, like what data to trust, what models to trust, what rules of thumb. And
well, on that, I mean, a lot of people were pointing to, the rule of thumb around, say, weakness in manufacturing tending to precede weakness in services, and that seems to have broken down. And then another one, I guess, is, the Fed tightens policy, and historically something has broken, and that hasn't really been the case. We had SVB, but, we got through that. And then you hear arguments being put forward that, actually higher rates, given the structure of the economy and baby boomers, etc., higher rates might be stimulative, or at least a big cohort of the economy may be benefiting from the higher rates. I mean, what's an economist to do given all of those kind of breakdowns in relationships and uncertainties and possible structural shifts in the economies? How do you say, well, we're going to look between all of that to see what are the things that we can still rely on?
Anything as complex as the past 4 years, you pick any dimension, but say inflation, because that's gotten all the attention of late. There's something that complicated there's going to be no one answer, right? So you're going to have a whole host of stories in the mix, and then you're down to, running out the story, looking for the empirical evidence, and then just weighing it out. I mean, it's a real frustration in macro. Like in real time, we're trying to give advice, like as macroeconomists, based on, what we know about the world, what we think we know about the world. And so, there's a big question on right now, is it appropriate for the Federal Reserve or other central banks to be cutting interest rates? Should they be waiting? What should they be looking for? And some of that, but definitely not some of it, an important piece of that kind of forward-looking advice is what's just happened over the past few years. Kind of how did that advice go that we gave over the prior few years? Was having a back and forth indirectly with someone who's very big on that. The Fed brought down inflation because of Fed credibility, inflation expectations, and I'm quite adamant that this inflation cycle has had very little to do with the Fed, that this was COVID and the disruptions it caused, and it's taken its time to work itself through, and it's taken time. And yes, I think the Fed should have acted, but I don't think the Fed should get credit, for this. But honestly, at the end of the day, how do I prove that inflation expectations were not crucial? How do I prove or disprove that the American people believe the Fed? I don't know. I mean, I work with the survey data. I don't trust the survey data on inflation expectations. And by the same token, how can I prove that it's really, these were very specific supply disruptions, some demand disruptions that were due to COVID, and they had the unwinding, and it's much more complicated. And yet, it's not just this idle, who gets credit for what. These are really important now for what does the central bank do. If they are convinced, if the Fed is convinced that it's because of their tough talk on inflation that they got inflation under control, well, then they're going to keep doing the tough talk because we're not quite there yet, right? They didn't get them and their tough talk that got it down, but it's like the labor market is not as great. And in the end, there will probably be, if someone could actually go in and adjudicate what is it, what was it, those two things, the roles of central banks, managing the expectations of fighting inflation, COVID dissipating along with the whole, these will all be in the mix. I'm sure of that. It's just this argument about exactly how much, and we won't know. And it's important for policy right now, and it's just really important for policy going forward. I think one of the only thing with this inflation expectations that will keep me going is a framing that comes out of this group of really smart economists thinking in this space is, well, no, actually this time really wasn't that different, right? Because this whole inflation expectation, central bank credibility, this is how we've dealt with inflation in the past. So really there was nothing new to see here, folks. And that's the piece of it that I'm just I feel like COVID should be a wake-up call to all of us that are there are types of inflation that our central banks are not well suited to fight, and probably shouldn't be, because of their much more targeted. And if we walk away saying, oh, no, it's all the central bank, and then we've missed the opportunity to step back and be like, we're missing some tools here, because we should not be relying on the passage of time to heal inflation that really is painful for a lot of people.
So, I mean, what you're saying is, okay, it was all, I mean, are you saying it was all supply driven? Team Transitory were ultimately right, even though it took a little bit longer and the Fed was a sideshow? Is that fair to say?
Well, I mean, that was an explanation that would have been missing in any normal kind of inflation cycle. And I think it was absolutely core to this inflation cycle.
I mean, what was unusual with this cycle? I mean, you could say, like the Fed can claim credit for bringing in inflation, but it was unusual that they were able to raise rates by over 5%, and it didn't materially impact the economy, which was very unusual in itself.
Normally, when there is an inflation cycle, fighting the inflation is like all about the Fed. It's considered to be center stage, right? Like they're the ones that go after the inflation. This inflation cycle has had very little to do with the Fed. Like they're there, and they did have a role. I mean, we did have demand pick up in a way that was almost unsustained, like a big burst. Some of that burst of demand came from, the extra relief money that went out during the first year of COVID. We also, a big demand shock in the U.S., not just the U.S. in general, was when, shut the economy down. People were afraid to go out and be doing service spend, like being out in public. And so you had a lot of pent-up demand that when the vaccines came out in early 2021, just flooded in. The Fed has tools and should be using tools when there is a flood of demand, right? Because they have interest rates, they can raise them. Interest rates are a price. Interest rates can help bring that demand down. So the Fed should be there. But I said, in a lot of ways, we should be really thankful this inflation was not the garden variety inflation, because if it were, we would have had a huge problem. Because as you pointed out, the Fed's quote unquote transmission was pretty weak in that. And I think this will be, to me, it's another fascinating about what we're learning, what we will likely learn from monetary policy over this period. We often talk about, we got up to a certain level of interest rate. So the federal funds rate's a little over 5% in the U.S. right now and has been for some time. Okay, so yes, that is notable. That's much higher than it had been. What was just mind-blowing in 2022 is we went from essentially 0 to 500 in like a year. And not only was it fast, it was unexpected. Like even when they started raising interest rates at the beginning of 2022, nobody had 475 basis point high. Things really took off. So you went from an environment of like essentially really low interest rates to, for several years, high interest rates. What became problematic for the Fed in this regard and its tools is, so the Fed, because it moves interest rates around, moves its Fed funds rates, financial markets move interest rates around, their effect on demand is going to come through demand sensitive sectors. Okay, the housing market should be a great example of how, where the Fed can do its work in the United States, because mortgages tend to be 30-year fixed. So they have fairly long duration relative to a lot of peer countries. And on top of that, what happened when interest rates are so very low, right after COVID, you had a big boom in home purchases, right? So you had people out buying. So before they raised rates, so like late 2021, those purchases. And then on top of that, and the big one is, the vast majority of people who had 30-year mortgages, they refinanced their mortgages when mortgage rates were rock bottom. And the typical U.S. homeowner, their monthly mortgage payments are lower now than before COVID. Despite, the Fed can raise interest rates all they want, right? Most people don't move. Most people aren't buying. Right. But this was a case where if you hadn't had that like going from 0 and all that refinancing, there were some real extremes there. But then that's meant that unlike normal so then you get into the Fed starts raising interest rates. They want to cool off demand. Well, typically when the Fed, and you see this actually in some other countries that have shorter term mortgage debts, house prices have fallen. But in the U.S., the house prices have actually risen because of this like structure where they now are sitting with mortgage rates that are so much lower than the market mortgage rate. And so they don't want to sell, they don't want to move because they're going to end up with these extra costs. So then they don't put their homes on the market. So yeah, there's less demand because interest rates are high, but there's even less supply. And so that pushes up house prices. So you can see where one of the spaces where the Fed should have like its kind of entry point in, I mean, housing is the interest rate sensitive, that it's not gone according to plan.
Based on all of that, the Fed, is still kind of progressing forward with it. I suppose its standard approach in terms of, it seems trying to assess whether policy is tight or not. Still talking about things like R-star, and to make that assessment is kind of looking at what does the current indicators say about the level of demand in the economy. Do you think that is right? Do you think how do you think how much weight should the Fed be putting on its inflation mandate versus its employment mandate? And how do you see policy, evolving from here?
And the Fed has a dual mandate, and I think the Fed has done. I think they agree with this. I mean, they certainly are, and the discussion coming out of the Fed has absolutely shifted as inflation has come down and the unemployment rate has risen. They have recognized that the risks of inflation coming in higher than they expected, and the risk of unemployment coming in higher than they expected, these are getting much more in balance. There's still risks, like they're writing down, which I think is the right forecast, but yeah, those are words, right? Those are not actions. And yet that's a good first step. And clearly recognizing, that wasn't the rhetoric a year, in 2022 or early 23 when inflation was really high and unemployment was very low. So yeah, there is an evolution in the way they're talking about or setting out their thinking that is consistent with an appreciation of the dual mandate. I mean, it's still the Fed, right? And any of the central banks, whether they have the tools that are necessary to deal or have been necessary to deal with this inflation, they are the institution that's tasked with inflation, right? There are Congress, there are other institutions that could step in, but the central banks have it in their mandate. So and often they are singular in that sense. There's not another government agency that also has it in their mandate. So it's understandable that they're concerned about, there's a heightened concern with the inflation. The piece, and I still see this in, I don't know, I feel like the ECB might be a model for having shaken this off, which I would never have expected. Early in the year, and you can still see this in the Fed's rhetoric, Raphael Bostic, so the president of Atlanta Fed, is a good example of this, talking about how the worst possible outcome this year would be for the Federal Reserve to cut rates too soon and then to have to raise them again. And that, to me, that's just one where it shows this inflation bias. I think arguably one could make a good case that the worst possible outcome this year would be an unnecessary recession to get, unnecessary. There's inflation was coming down anyways, and then the Fed allowed or caused a recession. But that goes to this. That goes to this strongman view of central banking that we can't be seen as looking soft on inflation. Policy adjustments happen all the time. This is kind of talking it up or talking up to the markets. Oh, when the Fed cuts, it'll be seismic and all this unwinding of, and it's just I just watched Christine Lagarde last week give a press conference where the ECB cut, despite the fact that they'd gotten some data that wasn't as encouraging. making very clear, like, we might not cut again for, like the world kept spinning, right? And I didn't feel like the ECB was thrown like to the side. Now, it could end up being a quote unquote mistake, right? And that they do have to raise. But again, if the ECB raise it, like, does the world stop spinning? Right? Now, the margin of error in Europe is not as high, right? The US, because it had such a strong recovery in the last few years, are in a place where we've got we're on a better footing than a lot of, say, Europe in terms of the economy. And yet that shouldn't be, the Fed shouldn't be running that out, right? Kind of abusing but
I wanted to talk about fiscal policy. I mean, that's been one of the parts of the story that has, I guess, surprised people. Going back 12, 18 months, a lot of people calling for a recession, and then we've had significant fiscal support in the US and deficits of 6-7% of GDP. And we've had this active industrial policy as well. Obviously, we had the fiscal supports during COVID, and now this industrial policy. And we had Gary Gerstle on this podcast recently. He's the author of The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order. So he's kind of arguing that we're past the neoliberal age. And, what preceded that was the New Deal, obviously. And I know something you're interested in. But I suppose the question is, are we heading back to more of a New Deal type of economics and more active fiscal policy and generally more higher deficits over time as well?
Regardless of who wins in November, there is no reason to expect smaller deficits in the U.S. There are several aspects of the three big investment programs. So the infrastructure, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. I think they're clearly not, move production in the U.S., build up productive capacities. So those kind of programs, and many, not all, but most of those programs were with bipartisan support, right? So there is an aspect of that. The theme is there in general. The industrial support, the more focused on, friendshoring, nearshoring, a particular trade. Disengagement is even too nice of a word, but trade relationships, say, relative to China or other, being much less favorable. So exactly the degree to which any of these things play out, and the degree will matter in terms of, well, do we think it's, adds a 10th to inflation, or do we think it adds a percentage point to inflation, right? So we've got proposals that are all over the place in terms of. So I think on the industrial side, the industrial policy, it's there. These programs are incredibly hard to do. But I guess one thing that will be interesting with some of these policies, and not just industrial policies, but also some of the more New Deal social policies, do people want them? Right? Are they popular? Right? This was a frustration, I think, having worked in a lot of President Biden's early on program, with the American Rescue Plan. This big fiscal relief. This was still one big push out of COVID, but it had some of the social the child tax credit. So the extending the child tax credit, which was essentially give the same amount of money to kids regardless of whether their parents work, how much income they have. Very much much more like a child benefit than other countries would have. The first time in the U.S. didn't depend on work. And cut child poverty in the United States by half. It was just, which this says a lot about how sad our safety net was for children before it. People fight for it? Nope. It didn't poll particularly well. It did fall victim. Its extension fell victim to inflation took off, and there were a lot of other concerns with but it didn't even setting that aside, it didn't particularly resonate with people. So these are big, expensive programs. These are major changes in how we either support American families or how we support American businesses, different communities. You're starting to pick winners and losers. And with Fiscal, it's a political economy. There is a constituency to always line up behind corporate tax breaks. And they will probably be out there. But I think that's one where is just interest that aspect of it, that maybe the Economist, like, I have nothing to add on how it resonates with people, but it's not, some of the way these programs landed was not as I would have expected.
Yeah. But as you say, it seems like no matter who is in the White House next year, the bias is for more spending and little appetite for austerity. And, so from the perspective of, debt sustainability and whether there are concerns around that, I mean, people always look at bond yields, but the other side of it is growth as well. So, I mean, what's your sense, thinking about the economic growth picture on a multi-year perspective and the factors that might influence it, like, immigration and labor force participation and productivity and things like that? Are you more or less upbeat on the kind of the medium to longer term outlook than you might have been gone back a few years, or not? Or how do you see that?
A clear lesson from this recovery, at least in the United States, relative to say now versus not just after the Great Recession, but after 2001, the 1990s, having a strong and rapid recovery, particularly in the labor market, does so much good. And as a corollary, avoids so much bad, right? That we've had, these bringing people in from the side, like we've had this amazing labor market growth. One thing that we've seen in the U.S. is productivity has moved up, growth. That doesn't have to that's very, talk about something that's tough to measure and can show up and disappear and come back. But that's huge. And then there's a real story. And we are also investing in infrastructure and business investment has looked great, even, not just what the government is doing. We are creating productive capacity in a way that has not been the case in earlier slow grinding recovery. So it's we had a good base. It reinforces how important it is to keep above a stall speed, right? To keep things going, that there's enough dynamism that you're bringing in more, and then it can add to it. So I think there was so much less scarring from the COVID recession than, really anybody should have thought when it happened. That was massive. That was huge. There were so many ways this was different, and yet there was a very concerted policy response across the entire world in the economy. Let's get out of this as quickly as possible. And maybe things were done too much, not the right thing, inefficient, at different times. But there was a clear, let's get out of this. And by and large, that's, I think, that has paid off. Now, then, using that principle of let's put the money in, let's invest in the economy so that we can help support that growth, right? That is the path that we're on. I think it's one that can pay off well. The conversations around, and I think in the U.S., the conversations around the sustainability will become more challenging, right? Because these are all big activist programs. It's not they spend money. They're very the government in their being active. Markets have to, believe or feel that they're getting, proof that the money's being quote unquote well spent. It's, the outcomes are going to be good. And as I said before, nobody has on their platform a meaningful plan to get the budget deficit down. And maybe they don't need to, right? Maybe, in the foreseeable future, we still have enough buyers for the government debt and da-da-da. But the thing is with the U.S., because of where the problems are, critical problems. Where the big spenders are in the entitlement programs. So we have for pensioners, whether it's the retirement benefits, the medical benefits, the taxes, which there are limits. Some Republicans have put limits on increasing taxes. And these are things where nobody wants to touch these. The levers you have to pull to bring down the deficit, are just politically complete non-starters. So then the only way the United States addresses its deficit is in crisis.
Yeah. I mean, the other way people sometimes say is obviously through higher inflation, and that's been actually obviously been helpful in the last few years as well. Do you think that is ever an actual conversation at the Fed or elsewhere to say, hey, let's let inflation go a little bit higher because it'll help that sustainability?
No, I don't. Especially, I think this cycle reminded us how much people hate inflation. But you could have somebody like, oh, no, Fed, your target's 3%. Congress could say that, right? That is their, and but then Congress would have to answer to the people being like, what do you mean I'm going to pay, more for my eggs so that some badly run government program can, yeah. I don't think that'll come as that's not going to be the solution piece. The problem is in the U.S., there's a lot of discussions of, you'll hear a lot about, oh, I have a proposal, I have a solution that actually doesn't solve anything. So in the U.S., despite some of the policy discussion, there's actually, you have some on the right that will it more or less come across you, let's cut all discretionary spending outside of military to zero. Right, everything for poor people, every social program. The thing is, you could do that. You shouldn't. Even if you did, you would still have a huge debt problem. These are just not big enough. And by the same token, you cannot go in and do all of this by raising taxes on the 1%. Right? There is a tax shortfall that could be addressed, but you have to have. At the end of the day, something has to happen where you go into entitlement spending and either cut benefits or raise taxes on entitlements. And that one is just, but a crisis is very good at sharpening the mind, right? So the economic solutions here are pretty straightforward. They've been with us for decades and decades. It's just a matter of a moment that is dire enough. We're not there, and it'll be far worse than the whole balancing it's really unfortunate that that's where that will go, but it may just be that it takes a very long time and we figure out some other things. So it's not my base case that we have debt sustainability come home to roost in the next 4 years, but it's gotten a lot more attention. And I think probably the more, we talk big fiscal programs, it's going to keep getting attention.
Good stuff. I'm conscious we're coming up to the hour, and we always kind of just ask our guests of things that were influential, maybe books they read over the course of their career, or any suggestions or advice to have for people who are interested in economics as to interesting sources of information. Or so any suggestions or anything that was very influential for you, or anything that you point to for people who want to get better at economics and macroeconomics?
My thinking about economics can often be shaped most by the time I spend not thinking about economics. Right. So it's, learning economics isn't all about just picking up every, the textbook, the latest, listening to the latest economist, thinking on this, that, or the other, getting a sense of, the economy works. It's just one piece of a bigger puzzle. So I do find, as someone who works in fiscal policy, and actually come to this in policy in general, I find the political economy very interesting. This is not standard mainstream. I didn't learn about political economy in my PhD at Michigan, University of Michigan. I did some at Denison's undergrad. So I think the political economy can be very interesting. And of course that means, that's a whole wide range that you can read up on. And I am absolutely fascinated by the history of economic thought. Just how people like me, sort of kind of think through answer these kind of questions. What would I have said now versus the me equivalent 100 years ago or 150? And it does give you a lot of humility in whatever we think is the best explanation or the best tools we have for addressing a problem today. Like you don't even have to go sometimes even 5 years later for people to look back and be like, oh yeah, that was really simple thinking, or how could they have used that method? But like that's the whole thing. There's progress, right? So it isn't good like not getting too attached to your own thinking about stuff, because like no, actually I want to be proven wrong because I want to figure out the right answer, And so you kind of that humility that it's not just all like we know right now. It'll change his thinking. But again, you have to get outside of the discipline to see that, because it's hard if you're just reading Economist to get that sense. So yeah.
Very good. Well, some good suggestions. So, Claudia, thanks very much for doing this today. It's been a great conversation. So make sure to follow Claudia's work, because as you can tell from today's conversation, we are living in a truly global, macro-driven world, and it's more important than ever to stay informed. So from all of us here at Top Traders Unplugged, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back soon with more exciting episodes, so stay tuned.
Thanks for listening to Top Traders Unplugged. If you feel you learned something of value from today's episode, the best way to stay updated is to go on over to iTunes and subscribe to the show so that you'll be sure to get all the new episodes as they're released. We have some amazing guests lined up for you, and to ensure our show continues to grow, please leave us an honest rating and review in iTunes. It only takes a minute, and it's the best way to show us you love the podcast. We'll see you next time on Top Traders Unplugged.